if you take Sri Lanka's yearly export earnings from non-petroleum exports, non-petroleum export means Sri Lanka export a very small amount of petroleum products. But if you take the Sri Lanka's annual export earnings from non-petroleum export sources, 50% of our annual income approximately spent on importing fossil fuels. For example, if you take 2012, about 51% of our annual export income was spent on importing fossil fuels, excluding coal. In 2013, this came down to about 41%, but still it's a fairly substantial figure. If you see where this petroleum imports ends up, 50% of the petroleum that we import ends up in the transport sector. The other 50% shares approximately equally between the electrical utility, that is electricity board, and the industry. So in other words, we can say that about 25% of our national income that we generate from our exports is spent in the transport sector in the form of fuels. This fuel is mainly petrol and diesel. All this time, we didn't have any option or a strategy to relieve ourselves from this requirement. All this time, we were dependent on liquid petroleum products to power our transport sector, and we did not have any other option. But with the re-emergence of electric vehicles, we now have an option of shifting our transport system from a liquid fossil fuel based, petroleum fossil fuel based transport system into an electricity based transport system. We have that option. Still, we have not started the journey, but we have the option. If we can shift from petroleum to electricity, then comes the question, how do we generate our electricity to power the transport system? If the fuel of choice of the transport sector becomes electricity, we have more than one indigenous options of generating electricity. Even if you ignore coal, which is fairly cheap, we have many indigenous generating options. Primary number one being wind, which we can use to generate electricity, which in turn can power our transport system. It is said that according to the recent studies, we have wind potential in the country, technically realizable wind potential, in class 4 to class 7 sites, which is class 4 and class 7 means good and excellent sites, leaving out all the land requirement. Still, there is potential to generate about 5,600 megawatts of electricity from wind. But there is one problem with wind, that we cannot absorb wind to the system in the amounts that we like, because it poses two major problems as a generating source. One is the intermittency, second one is non-dispatchability. Because of that, right now, when we absorb wind, we have to absorb only a certain amount of wind from the demand. That is, as the demand goes up, we can absorb more wind, but the amount of wind that we can absorb is limited by the demand. So if we can add an additional demand to our load curve, or the demand curve, demand coming from the transport sector, that demand can be shifted or transferred to wind electricity, so that we can absorb more wind due to the increase in demand, and that demand we can cater to the demand of the transport network. So this is a win-win requirement for the electricity sector as well as the transport sector, because we can utilize more of our wind potential by increasing the load curve. Particularly if you take the load curve, we have a fairly substantial problem in riding through the system off peak. Our system load drops to very low values. The valley is reached about 2-3 a.m. in the morning, and riding through that valley is a fairly difficult thing for the system operators, especially with large power plants like base load power plants like coal power plants in the system. So if we can jack up this valley period, if we can fill the valley by bringing in an additional demand, that will help in system operations. So one of the best options we have at hand in filling the valley is by bringing in the demand given by the electric vehicles. If we can give the electric vehicle, offer them a fairly attractive tariff for which is time of day, targeted off-peak tariff, then all these electric vehicles will start drawing current from the grid during the off-peak. That will increase our system minimum demand, and that will help us to operate the system more efficiently as well as more reliably. So even in that respect, I think electric vehicles is something that we must promote as a strategy, because that will help us in overcoming certain operational problems that we have. But how do we do that? How do we actually, as a utility or as a regulator or as the government, how do we promote electric vehicles? Right now, electric vehicles has few problems. The primary one being that it is limited by the range. If you charge the battery fully, there's a maximum distance that you can travel before either going for a charge or returning back to the origin to charge. One way of overcoming that is by installing charging stations, the public charging stations all over the country, like the fuel stations that we have. So if we can have charging stations where the electric vehicle owners, users can charge their batteries, either fast charge or slow charge, then our consumers will try to go more and more for electric vehicles, and electric vehicle penetration will increase. We also know that we have observed that from the introduction of hybrid vehicles, we have seen that our consumers, if we can give the proper fiscal incentives, our consumers seems fairly bold. Now, if you go to the roads, the majority of the vehicles that you see are hybrids. But when the hybrids were introduced 4 or 5 years back, it's virtually an unknown technology. But when the proper fiscal incentives are given, our people are fairly bold in going and buying, and thereafter all the infrastructure is built after the vehicles are there. The remaining infrastructure automatically comes up following that. So similar thing, if we can take a proactive step, install charging stations, give an encouragement to set up charging stations, give some sort of fiscal incentives, then charging stations will come up. And when charging stations will come up, the people will go for electric vehicles more and more. But there are certain other issues that you have to solve, like how do we pay when you charge your batteries at a charging station? Who pays? Who collects? Is it only the utility that has the right to collect money by selling electricity? There are so many things that we have to discuss and decide right now before the private sector go on their own and set up charging stations all around the country. Even whether we go for prepaid metering, which is an option, we can introduce a small smart card which can be used by the motorists to charge their batteries at any place they like, is one option. So similarly, we are now currently looking at a number of different options, and we have to select which will be the best strategy to promote electric vehicles penetration more. So mainly, in conclusion, I have to say electric vehicles looks a very attractive option for future Sri Lanka. One thing that will help us to utilize more of our indigenous energy resources. The most promising energy resource that we have at hand left is wind. So electric vehicles will help us to absorb more wind into the system, and also to relieve ourselves from our expenditure that we incur right now on fossil fuels. So in all that respects, electric vehicles looks a very promising option, but there are so many things that we have to discuss at the regulator and at the utility to facilitate this process in the years to come.